opened them up and they gushed forth their water. And so there were three sources of water. Now then, the earth was not as it is today. Let's go back and review that for just a moment.
You know, I'm gonna let this go. Let him talk. This is kind of, my biological dad had ancestors that were kind of this way.
It was more or less a flat earth, just like a baseball or something like that, completely round and filled or covered completely with water all around. Now that water could have been fairly deep. If it had all the water that is in the world today, that water could have been 10,000 feet deep. Because the water that is in the oceans today, if the earth would be spread out flat, not the depths and the high mountains, but spread out flat, the water would cover the earth. 10,000 feet. There's that much water on the earth today. We know that the greater portion of this world is made up of water, much more than land. So, on the second day, God then separated these particular waters. And then God on the third day did something else. On the third day, God separated the land from the water. Now, how did He do that? Did He just shove the water over there and made it stand on the heap? No, God used natural means. God shoved the land up a little bit and shoved the water down a little bit, the crevices or the ravines or whatever you want to call them, the depth down a little bit, so the water ran into that places and the land was there. And it didn't have to be very, very high, just like you folks here in Florida. You don't have much land over 300 feet down here. But it's land. And then you go a little ways and you get to the ocean. I don't know how deep it is out there, but that isn't the point. The thing about it is, God made it that way, and there were hills there, and maybe the hills were 500 feet, maybe the hills were 1,000 feet, maybe they were 2,000 feet. We have no way of knowing. God doesn't say. But there's good evidence that they were not 29,000 feet. Because the evidence is that God did that at a later time. So we see now, reading with verses 17 to 22, in the 7th chapter, these words, "And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the water increased, and bare up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth." So it began to float. And the waters prevailed, and were increased greatly upon the earth. And the ark went upon the face of the water. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth. And all the high hills. Now how high they were, He doesn't call them great mountains. We talk about the Mount Zion. Now Mount Zion is in Jerusalem. It's only 2,300 feet, but God calls it a mountain. And so He says, and the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits, that's 22.5 feet. Upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were all covered. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both the fowl of the cattle. The fowl died simply because they could find no food. The whole earth was covered with water. There was no place to find any food, and no place to settle down. And they couldn't live that way forever. That's why God let the water be that way for a long enough time, till all the fowl died. And of all the cattle, and of all the beasts, and of every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth, and every man, and in all whose nostrils was the breath of life, of all that was in the dry land, not on the ocean, but in the dry land, all of that died. Isn't it wonderful? God's so explicit. He gives us the detail. God is a God of detail. Then the 23rd verse, it says, "Only Noah only remained alive, and they that were with him in the ark were the only ones that remained alive." Now the first question, the next question is, how long did the water remain at this depth? What this depth was, I do not know. As I say, it could be up to 10,000 feet, but whatever it was, how long did it remain there? Well, the 7th chapter in the 24th verse says, "And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days." Now it rained for 40 days. How long that it took for the windows of heaven to drop their water down, I do not know.
Yeah, but
He didn't say.
It's awesome.
How long it took for the fountains of the deep to open up and bring all their water forth, I don't know either.
Just flow.
Just didn't say.
You don't
all
have
He
to
tells
think
us
about
how long
it.
it did, it was how long it rained.
Yeah, that's what the flow is.
And then the rain quit. And then for another 110 days, God kept the water at that level. And if God hadn't brought about some type of a catastrophe, that water would still be around the earth at that level today. It couldn't evaporate. There was no place to go to evaporate. All the water that there is in the sky that has evaporated, if all of that water could be brought upon a flat earth, it would cover the earth by 2 inches only. That's all. So the water was upon the face of 150 days, all told. So that there would be no chance whatsoever for any life, anything, any kind of thing, fall or anything, to come out of that thing alive, except that which was inside of the ark. Then, after 150 days, God began to do something else. It tells us then that the water began to recede. And I note now, beginning with chapter 8, we read there, and God remembered Noah and every living thing, and by the way, that word remembered me doesn't mean that God forgot him. But God simply says it's time for Noah to be taken care of, and every living thing, and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. Now, does he mean that he took the wind in order to evaporate the water? Where would all that water go to evaporate? No, that's not why he sent the wind. He sent the wind to dry up the earth whenever he got rid of the water. And the fountains of all the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters returned from off the earth continually. And after the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And the ark rested on the 7th month, in the 17th day of the month, on the mountains, plural please, of Ararat. Not just some particular individual mountain. Well, first of all, now we want to ask another question before we continue. How much of the earth was covered with that flood? We have a lot of scientists nowadays trying to tell us that that flood was just a great, terrible, upheaving flood down by the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, as it possibly filled that whole valley, and that's where the people mostly lived, you know, and that this is one of those floods. Well, I want to ask you a question, just a plain question that we don't need to answer, but the answer is obvious now. God kept that water at that particular level for 150 days. Tell me something. Will water stay in one particular locality, if it's a great big flood, for 150 days without finding its way to the rest of the world, to the lowest spot?
Right.
If it was covering everything to the depth that God said it must have covered to death?
I'm loving this, dude. I'm really loving him.
All flesh died. There was no place to go, no place to hide. They couldn't run. They couldn't find anything. All died. All the hills were covered.
Yeah, and then it dies. And,
the flood's
and then we
total
dig it
time
up
on the
later
earth
and we
was
find out what
some
was
over 1 year.
But it's all cool. Daddy's awesome.
Now the laws of nature, of course, causes all the water to seek its own level. So that water will always run to the lowest spot. It's always doing that. It's always done that. No local flood could possibly maintain its level for 150 days and then another 110 days after the rain stopped. So where did the water go when it subsided? Well, the first thing he said here is he stopped all of the sources of the water.
Who was recording
He stopped that after 40 days. So there were no more sources of water coming in. But then where did the water go after that? Well, now he does not answer that particular question right here in the book of Genesis.
If you would like to be.
But the psalmist, in rehearsing the greatness and the almightiness of God and in praising God, in Psalm 104 gives us the answer. Now this is one time when I had to go to another translation beside the King James, because the King James did not give us a very clear understanding of what he meant. Now after I've read it in another translation, I'm going to read it in the New American Standard Bible, which I believe is a very, very accurate Bible. I'm going to read it from that, and then you read it in the King James, and you'll see what King James means when the way they translated it. But I'm going to read it to you, beginning with verse 5. He established the earth upon its foundation, so that it will not totter forever and ever. He's just rehearsing now what God has done with reference to creation and so on, and he comes right down the line. And if you read the whole psalm, it's a blessing to you, because it tells how God takes care of all of the animals, the springs of water for the animals and the birds and everything. He goes on to that, but he brings in this matter of the flood. Verse 6, Thou didst cover it with the deep, as with a garment, that is, with water, as just taking a garment and covering the whole earth with it. The waters were standing above the mountains. Verse 7, And at thy rebuke they fled. God said, Now waters, recede. They had to flee. Where did they flee to? Listen to it. And at the sound of thy thunder, they hurried away. Where did they hurry to?
Yeah, I'm
Next
just
verse
saying,
gives
I
us
mean,
the answer.
people who wrote that
And the
couldn't
mountains
see what we
rose,
can see.
and the valleys
The gifts
sank
that he gave
down
us along the way,
to
my
the
God,
places
I am so
where thou
impressed.
didst establish for them forever.
He's always him.
What did God do?
You know,
God pushed down
for real.
the places
I love
of
this dude. He's cool.
the valleys, and
He's
by
trying,
doing so, He pushed up
based
the
on
mountains.
what he can see.
Many of you have
accept
seen
that
the
I
Rocky
can see
Mountains.
from the moon, and
They are possibly as good an
cameras can do a
illustration
lot
of what has
things,
happened
and
in this type of a
archaeologists
catastrophe.
find their stuff.
There you see many mountains turned upside down.
Bottom
This
line,
way,
how the
this
hell
way,
we
this way.
get here?
You see the strata of rock.
Satan
God
wouldn't do
simply
it.
pushed down the sea or the
Satan's trying
valley,
to kill us.
and then the water had to flow in where,
You
that,
get
where
his ear.
the valleys were, and He raised the mountains, the water had to flow up. That's how simple it's all about. God just simply did it that way. Just that simple. I want to read one more verse and then I come back to this. Thou didst set the boundaries, that is, of the waters, that they may not pass over again, that they may not return to cover the earth once again. Now, this is said in many other places too. I'll take you to the Grand Canyon for just a moment. I know the Hopi Indians. I was born among the Hopi Indians, and they have a little sort of a tradition. And by the way, there are hundreds different types of traditions. They're found all over the world concerning the flood. They all differ just a little bit.
I do.
And different types of
I'm a
a story
whole
told in their way,
person.
just passed down the line. But anybody can recognize them as a story of the flood. But the thing I wanted you to think about was the Great Grand Canyon. When I stood there at the ridge, at the edge of the Great Canyon, and I began to read somewhat to some of the signs that says how that the water flowed down there for so many hundreds and millions and billions of years, you know, and has sort of washed out all of that water, I thought to me, how dumb can some so-called scientists be? Number one, the Grand Canyon is up like this, so the river would have to flow way up over here to 9,000 feet, if you please, from down the level over here, maybe about 1,500 feet, have to flow up, and then down over here, and then begin to wash, and wash the place 15 miles wide, but it's only a few hundred feet wide down at the bottom. Well, that's the first thing that is so crazy and absurd. The second thing is, I walked down the Grand Canyon. And I noticed especially, I had read this about the certain stratas of rock. There are 5 different stratas of rock, different colors. There's a kind of a white rock and a red rock and yellow, I think, and the black and so on. But the black is the lower one. But the interesting thing about that lower strata of rock that proves something that we're saying about right here is this. As you come down to the riverbed, you will notice that the lower strata of rock is black. On the south side, that strata is about 100 feet thick. On the north side, that black strata is over 1,000 feet thick. Now the river is only a few feet wide. How come that there's one strata higher than the other? Because they fit it together like this. Very simple. The north rim of the Grand Canyon is 1,000 feet higher than the south rim. When God started this catastrophe, He just shoved that side 1,000 feet higher than He shoved this side. He just simply shoved it up and it just burst open and the water ran off. That's simple, isn't it?
Yeah, I dig it.
Maybe you can understand that. That's the way God works, my dear friends. That's the way God works then. He shoved the mountains up. He caused a tremendous catastrophe. He upset the mountains. He shoved them this way and that way and shoved these down. The lowest spot in the ocean is some 30,000 feet deep. The highest mountains we have are some 25,000 feet high. Now that is nearly 12 miles apart. But God did that great work, and you know water always flows down. Imagine when these rocks began, when these mountains began to rise, and it gets higher and higher and higher and higher, and it got deeper and deeper here, how that water must have rushed down those 12 miles in a very short distance down to the very depths of that water. What all went on when that water began to rush down there? That's where you have an answer to a lot and lots of the other questions that people bring up. All the animals have now died. And of course, they just sort of sank to the lower spots wherever they were at that particular time. But then when God began to push this up and began to push this down, all of that was rushed down. And here's a crevice, and here's a crevice, and that's where it deposits a bunch of animals. And that's where you have your fossils. And plant life down there, and that's where you have your fossils. All kinds of them, all pushed together. Even way up in North Siberia, where it's terrifically cold, They
Time.
water
I
in
gotta pee.
Belgium,
I
and
need
they
a
froze
beer,
it once,
too.
and they have found
I still
animals
dig this guy.
completely, preserved in frozen.
He really believes everything he's saying, and
Icelands out there in the
I'm
far north.
listening and I'm watching.
These are just some of these
Yeah,
wonderful
I am,
scientific
ain't I?
facts. When Jesus Christ is coming again, there's going to be another catastrophe. You read the book of Revelation. It simply says there's going to be an earthquake such as the world has never seen and never heard of. And the islands are going to flee and the mountains are going to flee and so on and so on. God's going to have a tremendous upheaval sometime at His second coming. Just when, I don't know. But I do know that when He comes and sets His foot upon Mount Olives, it's going to split wide open. The Mount Olives is about 2,300 feet above sea level. And then, of course, on the one side, just about 20, 25, 30 miles away, is the Mediterranean Sea. That's what we call sea level. Over on the other side is the Dead Sea in the Jordan Valley down there, and that's 1,300 feet below sea level. That's the lowest spot on the earth. But when Jesus Christ comes again, that whole mountain's going to split. Part of it's going to go to the north, part of it's going to go south, and the water from the sea is going to flow in there. And whether God's going to raise this up, I don't know. If not, He's going to make another great lake over on this side, and they're going to have fresh water, and there's going to be fishing on both sides. Now there's no fish on one side. God has done it, and God's going to do it again. And scientists collaborate with this and to say this is absolutely true. So then, at the time that the flood came, it is very possible that the mountains weren't very high. It's very, very possible that God didn't raise that ark that they were in way up to the top of Mount Ararat up there, because you see, there it was 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 below zero, and they didn't have any central heating systems in those days. All those animals and Noah and everybody would have froze to death up there. It rested upon the mountains, and when they were pretty low possibly, and then God eventually raised it up over there. Well, these are just some of the things I thought you ought to know about, or at least I want you to think about. Think of the churning of the debris and the wreckage of all of these things as the water began to flow down to its level. The fossils were not formed over a period of 1,000,000 years. Such a thing does not happen. You cannot form fossils over periods of millions of years. The fossils are formed because of sudden catastrophe, when pressure of land masses suddenly comes down upon them and they come under pressure. Coal beds and many other things like that are formed at such a time also. So it's through all kinds of animal life and plant life and so on together, and that's where you find your fossils today. As the flood waters flowed down then, the heavier debris dropped down to the bottom, the lighter debris to the top. Now scientists want to use that as a figuring out way. It just took so many millions for this and so many of this and so many of this and so on. Fossils were found everywhere, which all date back to the flood. I was born in Oribe, Arizona. My sister was born on the Mesa in Oribe, Arizona, which is 500 foot higher. She was born of higher birth than I was. On top of that mesa, there were plenty of seashells. Seashells, I said. And they were found all around there on that desert floor. Where'd they come from? Well, you know the answer.
34 seconds, eh?
There are no fossils being formed today.
Man, it's so fucking cold out. I gave the dog the pardon. You can piss and shit in the house. We'll wash the throw rugs and clean up your shit. In Chet, he's a timber wolf. I'm still hoping he's okay. Either somebody took him in and he was raised by humans, so he probably knows how to play if they know how.